I thought I was going to have to deal with that gecko's nuttiness for the rest of my life, girl. But you saved me, girl. You saved me. He fell in love with you, and now I ain't never got to worry about this ninja no more. Thank you, girl. Thank you. You want a drink? Well, hello there, love bugs. Hello there, Bellas. If you have not already done so, please remember to like, share to Facebook, subscribe, and visit uptopbeauty.com. Today's looky would be our Ronnie Bear headband. Oh, look at this. So queenly, baby. Oh, I love it. So we have them in the black and green. And we have the gray coming in soon. So go on over there to uptopbeauty.com and check it out. And if you are not already a part of this book club, please hit the Patreon link below and or the join button here on the YouTube. And for a small monthly fee of $5, you babies, yes, you can be privy to all the shenanigans before the YouTube gets it, if the YouTube gets it. Now, let's continue talking about Ronnie Spector's Be My Baby. River Deep, Mountain High was a song that Phil recorded with Tina Turner in March of 1966, and it was a great record. Phil captured the rawness in Tina's voice and made it a part of his wall of sound, and the result was a record that sounded tremendous. It should have been one of Phil's biggest hits, but it turned out to be his biggest failure. Now that's news to me. I'm telling you from my whole heart and soul, I thought that was one of the most magnificent songs that I've ever heard in my life. And if I've ever respected Phil Spector without knowing that he was the white Dr. Dre, I would have respected him just for the arrangements in that song alone. So I'm confused, but I'll move forward. He did everything he could to push River Deep, Mountain High, but the American DJs just wouldn't play it. I guess they all thought Phil had gone too far with that one. It was a huge hit in England, but in this country, it barely got on the charts. I don't know. Y'all tell me why y'all think it didn't do good in America. Because that song is outstanding, incredible, dynamic. Phil was crushed. He was so depressed he didn't go near the studio for months. He just moped around his mansion, playing pool all day. I was spending a lot of time with him in those days, but there was nothing I could do to cheer the guy up. I hated seeing Phil depressed like that, but I figured it was just a matter of time before he got inspired again. And I was determined to stick by him until his dark mood passed. Thank God I still had my live shows with the Ronettes to take my mind off of Phil's depression. Even without a recent hit, we were still popular enough to get a booking at Manhattan's Basin Street East, a classy nightclub that was just starting to book rock and roll acts. We opened there in July of 1966, and I'll never forget that night. We did a great show, and the crowd loved us, but it's not what happened on stage that sticks in my mind. I was sitting in our dressing room backstage when one of the waiters came back and told me there was a lady out front who wanted to talk to me. I asked him who it was. She didn't say, he told me. She just said to tell you she was a good friend of Phil's. I was curious, so I followed the waiter out to the table in front of where this pretty young blonde woman was sitting with a guy in a suit. The waiter pulled a chair out for me, and the woman stood up and held out her hand. "I'm Annette Spector," she said, shaking my hand. "I've heard so much about you. At first, I didn't even realize who she was, Annette Spector. I'd blocked the name out of my head the first time I heard it, so I just assumed this girl was one of Phil's cousins. Then she said, I wanted to introduce myself and let you know there are no hard feelings. That's when I figured it out. Annette had been divorced from Phil for about 6 months. Pause before we go further. The reason why Annette came out to see your show and shake your hand was because she was thanking you for taking that nut off her hand. With that, I thought I was going to have to deal with that gecko's nuttiness for the rest of my life, girl, but you saved me, girl. You saved me. He fell in love with you, and now I ain't never got to worry about this ninja no more. Thank you, girl. Thank you. You want a drink? You need me to buy you a drink? Because I can, girl. You want a piece of cake? Garçon, come get this lady a drink immediately. I owe this bitch my life. I think Annette sensed how tongue-tied I was because she introduced her companion. He was some kind of lawyer or something, and then offered me a drink. See what I'm saying? You saved her, Ronnie Spector. Because you came into Gecko Spector's life, he was willing to set her free. Now you is the caged bird, not me. Now I can date this glorious man right here, this lawyer man that's going to make my life happy. I think Annette sensed how tongue-tied I was because she introduced her companion. He was some kind of lawyer or something, and then offered me a drink. I was glad she did because at least that gave me an excuse to say something. Oh no, I thought. Now she'll think I'm some kind of drunk who can't wait till after the show is over to get a drink. No! She's giving you a drink because she wants to thank you for getting that crazed maniac out her head. By this point, Annette and her friend were both smiling, so I said a quick goodbye and stood up to get the hell out of there. But as I was walking back to the dressing room, something made me spin around for a last look. Annette, I blurted. Then in a whisper, I said, thanks. The girl's like, no, bitch. Thank you. Thank you. Richard Pryor was our opening act that night, but he was still a young unknown then. And I honestly don't remember much about his act. In fact, I don't remember much about our show that night either. I guess I was just happy to get through it. We had a second memorable night during our run at Basin Street East. It happened a few nights later. We just finished our show when our tour manager, a nice old guy named Val Irvin, told us he had some important news. Okay, the important news is John Lennon's still on the line, girl. I don't know what the hell you did with him. You must got the best French kiss in the world, girl, because John Lennon is still on the line. The Beatles had contacted the tour manager and said that they wanted the Ronettes to open for them on tour. Opening for a Beatles tour was probably the greatest thing that could happen to any group in the 60s. That's what finally got the Ronettes on the cover of Ebony magazine. I couldn't wait to tell Phil, so I called him in California as soon as I got home that night. But even though I thought it was the greatest news in the world, all Phil could say was, what's wrong, Phil? I asked. Nothing's wrong, he said. But he obviously had something on his mind. We can talk more after you get back out here. But Phil, this is the Beatles. I expected to at least hear an argument of some kind, but Phil just ended the conversation with a statement that really confused me. Ronnie, he said very slowly, we've got to think about your career. Okay, Phil, I said, I'll see you next week. I didn't give it much thought after that. You could never predict Phil's reaction to anything, so I'd given up trying to second guess him. When I got out to California, I didn't even bring up the subject of the tour. In fact, neither of us mentioned it until Phil took me down to Gold Star. And that was a surprise because I knew Phil hadn't been to the recording studio in months. I followed him into a storage office and watched as he started shuffling through a few boxes of old recording tapes. He still hadn't said a word when Larry Levine poked his head in to say hello. They made a little small talk, and I was just starting to get bored when Phil revealed what this whole game of going down to Gold Star was all about. Oh, by the way, Larry, he said, trying to sound casual, can you see about booking us some studio time in August? I'd like to get started on Ronnie's next record. Larry said he'd look into it, and then he left. That's when I spoke up. But Phil, I said, I'm supposed to be on tour with the Beatles in August. Ronnie, he said, reaching into another box of old tapes, you've got to ask yourself, do you want to do another live tour or do you want to get back in the studio and make another hit? Pause. If y'all don't see what I'm seeing, Larry Levine ignored his ass because he didn't have anything. All he wanted to do was to size. I hope you guys know what trickery, danger, trickery. That's what size means, trickery. All he wanted to do was size Ronnie into thinking that she does not need to go on that tour because he has a hit waiting for her. So he took her on down to Gold Star, pretended like he was looking for her hit. Larry Levine just walking past, Oh, Larry, can you book us some time? Larry like, okay, I'll go with it. I'll look into it. Larry, the same ninja who knew that he was a married man the whole time that didn't tell Ronnie nothing. So it's all the great goop, okay? But I move forward. But Phil, this isn't just any tour. This is the Beatles. That's even more reason to skip it. Nobody's coming to those shows to see you. Those concerts are nothing but a freak show. Ask the Beatles. They'd be the first to admit it. But do what you want. It's your career. Then I watched as Phil flipped through the same box of tapes for the third time. He is so full of it. That's when I saw his hands were shaking. Obviously, something about this tour was upsetting Phil so much he couldn't even talk about it. And I had a pretty good idea what it was or who. It was that damn weasel John Lennon. The Ronettes did go on tour with the Beatles, but my cousin Elaine stood in my place. The same as she did for part of the Dick Clark Caravan of Stars tour. The tour turned out to be such a circus that no one even noticed the switch, except the Beatles, and they were pissed. Oh, so my mother told me. The girls had called Ronnie while on tour and was like, Ronnie, you ain't missed nothing. These Beatles fans is crazy. They don't even listen to you sing. They just sit there and scream the whole damn time. They couldn't hear us sing because they were screaming so loud. August 1966 was probably the darkest month of my life. No matter how miserable I might have been with the Beatles, nothing could have been worse than the month I spent with Phil in his mansion. He was still bummed out over the failure of River Deep Mountain High. And I found out that Phil was hell to be around when he got depressed. He'd lock himself into the second floor study for days on end, only coming out to eat or sleep. Could you imagine the smell? I never knew exactly what he did in there all day. Sometimes I'd hear him talking on the phone doing business. Other times he'd just sit there playing his records in the dark. He was definitely developing into a depressed case. But what really put Phil under was when he got the news that his friend, Lenny Bruce, had died of an overdose. Phil never told me that Lenny died. I found it out by accident one night when I couldn't sleep. Phil had been locked up in his study most of the evening, but I happened to be wandering past when he finally opened the door. When I looked at him, I couldn't help but notice that his eyes were all red, like he'd been crying. What's wrong, Phil? I asked. Nothing, he said, trying to act normal. What are you doing still up? I don't know, I said. I just couldn't sleep. She went in there after him. Child, it was photos all over the place of Lenny Bruce's dead body sprawled out with drug needles all over the floor. Okay? I'm like, why would somebody have that or keep that? But that's what happened. In the fall of 1966, the Ronettes left for an extended tour that included a series of concerts at U.S. Army bases in Germany. After that terrible month with Phil, I was glad for a chance to go back on the road for a while. It wasn't so much that I wanted to get away from him. I just needed a break from being cooped up in the house. I was still so attached to Phil that I hated going a day without hearing from him. Germany turned out to be the Ronettes' last tour. We never made any big plans to split up, but after we got back to the U.S., it just seemed like a natural thing to do. Phil hadn't recorded us in months, and the other two Ronettes were getting sick of waiting for him. Nadra made plans to marry Scott Ross and start her own family as soon as we got back from Germany. And Estelle was just as anxious to settle down with her boyfriend, Joe Dong. Phil and I weren't married yet, but by the start of 1967, I was spending more time at the mansion than I was at home in New York. My mother still thought I was living in hotel rooms when I went out to California. Or at least that's what I told her, and she never questioned it. But I knew she wasn't stupid. It was just a matter of time before she stopped looking the other way. I mentioned it to Phil one night after dinner. We were sitting in the kitchen, which is where we usually ate. I can't remember the last time I talked to my mom, I said. So he said, pick up the phone and call her. I'm afraid to, I explained, because if I do that, she'll ask me where I'm staying, and I can't lie to her anymore. But if I tell her the truth, I don't think she'll like it. Don't worry, Phil told me, picking up the phone in the pantry. All you have to do is tell her we got married last weekend. You don't know my mother, Phil. She never believed that story. Well, then, he said, dialing my mother's number, we'll have to convince her. When my mother answered, Phil said a quick hello and then tried to pass the phone off to me. Go on, he whispered, holding his hand over the receiver. Holding your hand over the receiver, that would be the part that is closest to your mouth on a phone, was the same thing as mute. Tell her, but I wouldn't touch that phone. I can't, I told him. Okay, he said, if you won't tell her, I will. He turned and spoke directly into the phone. I've got some great news, Mrs. Bennett. Your daughter and I were married last week. There was a long pause, and I knew she didn't buy it for a second. She started asking him all kinds of questions, and the more answers he gave, the more incredible his story grew. The service was performed by 2 practicing rabbis, he said. There were no witnesses. It was an obscure Hebraic ceremony, very ancient. After hearing that, my mother insisted that Phil put me on the line. Hi, Mom, I said, trying to sound cheerful. What is this story Phil's telling me about 2 ancient Hebrews? She asked. I didn't want to lie to my mother, but it was all so weird. Here I was, standing in the pantry with Phil on my left side and a big jar of mayonnaise on the other, and my mother talking in my ear. I didn't know what else to do, so I finally just told her, it's true, Mom. Phil and I really did get married last week. You did you? She said. Well, I guess I'm going to have to come out there myself to see about the marriage. And you better hope it's for real, because if it's not, I'm going to carry you right back home to New York. I didn't raise no daughter of mine to live with no man. Child, that was a big deal. Living together, shacking up, not them. You would marry a bitch even if you didn't like her.